The last market structure we're going to look at is an oligopoly. An oligopoly is a very realistic market structure with very reasonable assumptions of the model. The first assumption is that this is a market with very few firms, and this select few firms have a very high market dominance. So the market concentration is in the hands of select few companies. Think 3-4 companies. This is also a market where you can have both differentiated and homogeneous goods being sold. So you could have differentiated markets like the soda market with Pepsi and Coca-Cola as an example of a market with differentiated goods. But you could also have a homogeneous goods market like the oil market, right? So an oil is a type of product that's, it doesn't matter if Exxon makes it, ExxonMobil, or Shell makes it. It's a homogeneous good. This is a market where firms are price makers nonetheless. And so this is a market with high market dominance, some varied product types, and firms being price makers. But this is also a market that you can't just enter easily and exit easily because of the high barriers to entry and exit. And what makes this a very unique market structure is the interdependence of actions. And this is a very interesting point that I think you need to look at now, because this sort of sets a precedent for what sort of diagrams you're expected to use here. So there's an interdependence of actions of firms. So firms are aware of one another in this market. And the actions of firm A influence the actions of firm B and vice versa. And so this leads to a lot of different scenarios where firms don't just compete on price, but also they have non-price competition. I hope this also sort of set a precedent for what sort of things you should be asking yourself when you see oligopoly questions, because you could have several diagrams explain an oligopoly. It just depends on the situation at hand. It depends on the context. The first sort of diagram you could see is not really even a diagram. It's the game theory diagram. In IB economics, they use game theory and prisoner's dilemma synonymously, but at the university level, you'll see that game theory is almost its own branch of economics, and you can have many different game scenarios, with prisoner's dilemma being one of them. But nonetheless, I digress. You could have several diagrams explaining an oligopoly, and the first one is the game theory. Here, we're showing the strategic interdependence of firms. This is oftentimes used to talk about pricing strategy of companies in the market. So that's the first diagram you could have explain an oligopoly. The second diagram you could have is a non-collusive oligopoly. This is also known as a Kinked-demand curve diagram. And this is something we're going to look at in this lesson, just like this one. And the last diagram you can have explaining an oligopoly is a collusive oligopoly. And here you would just use a monopoly diagram. Why? Well, I hope I sort of gave you an idea here that there is an interdependence of firm actions. And so there is a dilemma for firms to collude or to not collude. That is the question, collude or not to collude. There is an interdependence of firms in this market, and this interdependence makes these firms have strategic behavior. So every firm wants to predict the strategy and actions of its rivals, and they base their own actions on the expectations of what their rivals are going to do. I sort of hope you understand where this is going. And this strategic anticipation and behavior leads to conflicting interests. Because on the one hand, you want to compete, and there's an incentive to compete. After all, the more market share you capture, the better off you are. But if there's 3 or 4 of you, you can get together and collude, and there's a incentive to collude. And if you collude, you're essentially acting as a monopoly, hence the monopoly diagram. So when we're thinking about interdependence, we're thinking about either game theory or non-collusive Kinked-demand curves. And when we're thinking about collusion, we're thinking about the monopoly diagram. Jumping on to the first diagram we're going to look at the game theory diagram. We're going to look at the game called Prisoner's Dilemma. Game theory is looking all at strategic interdependence and the incentives that make firms want to compete or to collude. And this diagram depicts precisely this. When we look at pricing strategies of firm A and firm B, we see that firms can either have a high price or a low price when setting their prices. A prisoner's dilemma game, by the way, is very much like it's based on prisoner's dilemma, and it looks at the payoffs of two prisoners that are taken hostage, and they have a situation. Do they testify? Does one person testify against the other? Does the other person testify against the first person? Do they both keep quiet, or do they both testify? And based on that, they have a payoff. And the idea is that if they both agree to not cheat, they have a similar payoff. We're going to look at this in more greater detail, but I just want to give you the idea of what a prisoner's dilemma is, sort of spiritually what the idea is. The idea is that if you both don't cheat and you both follow the rules, you have this payoff. If one of you cheats, one of you gets a good payoff, 80 M's, and the other one gets a 20 M payoff. But if you know that this person is going to cheat, you're also going to cheat. If you think you're going to cheat, you're hoping you get this payoff, but in reality, if you both cheat, you end up with this payoff, the smallest payoff possible. So this is sort of the idea behind a prisoner's dilemma. You need to anticipate your competitors or your opponent's actions, and based off that, you make your own strategy. And so game theory is supposed to demonstrate this important feature of behavior of oligopolistic firms. And let's look at this diagram. Like, suppose there are two firms. We have firm A and firm B. And both of these firms have their own pricing strategies. Again, they have high prices and low prices. And they don't know what to do. Of course, they want to have high prices. They want to have high prices. But if they have high prices, their opponent is going to give low prices and capture the market, right? High prices for firm A, they would love that. But if they have a high price, there's a possibility that firm B is going to give a low price, and then they're going to have a higher payoff. Ideally, when you're looking at game theory diagrams, you start at the worst payoff possible. So you start with the outcome 4, where you see that because there is price competition, both of them are going to use low prices, and they're going to be in this situation, scenario 4, where they both have a 10 million payoff if they have a low pricing strategy. Then we look at a situation where they agree to collude. So we see that they both have a high price here, and if they collude, they can actually keep this high price here, and then they get a payoff of 50 million each. That's why I said we need to start here. But collusions are sensitive, and if one of them cheats and lowers their prices while the other one has high prices, for example, let's say they want to collude with high prices, but if one of them cheats, they have a higher payoff. For example, firm A has a low price while firm B has a high price. Firm A is going to have $80 million made, and vice versa. If firm B cheats, when firm A has a high price, they get $80 million. So this is sort of a box that shows different types of payoffs based on the strategy and anticipated strategy of your opponent. The next diagram we're going to look at is the Kinked-demand curve. The Kinked-demand curve is a very interesting diagram because it shows non-collusive oligopoly behavior. And I started by just drawing this part first, just drawing the demand curve, which shows the average revenue curve. And there are several insights that we could see here from the beginning. We see that the market price is at P1 and at Q1, and it comes right at this dent, right at this point before the slope of this AR curve changes. So we see it's less steep, and then it becomes more steep at this point. And I think I think you can remember, if you recall microeconomics, that the slope of the curve pertains very much to the elasticity of the diagram. So when we see a kinked curve, we need to think that there's different levels of elasticities at different levels of slopes. So at this point, we have a very different elasticity than at this point, right? And so this price comes at the middle point of those elasticities. How does that work? Well, we need to remember that companies compete on price, and they also compete on non-price factors. But let's say a firm is at this point and they decide to lower their price. They lower their price to P2 and they capture this much more demand. But we see that the shift in quantity demanded is this much, right? It's this much. So they lower their price much more. So the gap here is much greater than the change here. So the change here is much greater than the change here. If they choose to, apologies. If they choose to increase their prices from P1 to, let's say, P2 over here, we see that the drop in quantity demanded is going to be much bigger. So again, the change here is much smaller than the change in the quantity demanded here. So they lose a lot of quantity demanded here. Okay, I hope this sort of makes sense. So yeah. So the change in quantity demanded is much bigger than the change in the price. All right, and then we remember that the marginal revenue slope is always half of the AR slope. So our marginal revenue slope is something like this, almost something like this. And then it stops here, and then it drops off here, right? And then we have different marginal cost structures somewhere from here. And these are our nice MC curves. Okay, what does this tell us? Okay, then what does this tell us? So we see that the MR curve is always half as steep as the AR curve, but we also see that it goes up to here, and then it stops for this period, and then it continues down here. You don't need to know this for IB economics, you just need to know that there's a little period gap here that there's no diagram, there's no MR here. And this period, this area here is actually referred to as the area of indeterminacy. So this part here is known as the area of indeterminacy. So the marginal revenue curve is non-existent for this period. So when you're drawing the marginal revenue curve, just knows it goes up to here, and then at the Q1 line, at the Q line intercept, it stops, and then it continues from under the axis. And all you need to know is that because of elasticity, price isn't going to go higher and it isn't going to go lower, because the amount of sales that you get is actually lower either way, because either the quantity demanded increase is not worth the price decrease, or the quantity demand decrease is so much bigger than the price increase gains. So this is the market price we're stuck at. And a profit maximizing firm is going to be producing at this amount, and at some sort of MC over here, they're going to be producing at this level to make sure that MC equals MR. And MR is at this line. So firms are going to be producing at this blue area, because this is where they can maximize profit, because they want to have MC equal MR. So you have these MC curves, and they're going to be somewhere here. If the firms are going to be maximizing their profits, they're going to be producing somewhere here. Okay, the next diagram we're going to look at is the actual monopoly diagram. And I think it's pretty intuitive, so I'm not going to talk too much about a monopoly diagram. If you want to see a monopoly diagram, you could check the video in the description below. We'll show it to you. But essentially, the idea here is that when you have a collusive diagram, firms act as a monopoly, and so they're able to earn supernormal profits or abnormal profits because they control the market and act as a monopoly. A small recap. So, just some my advice. I prefer not to do. At least I advise my students not to use the game theory diagrams or graphs in essays, because they're very easy to mess up, as you can see here, and every teacher has their own way of creating these sort of diagrams. So when an essay question comes up, I just suggest to do either this curve or this curve. And again, I drew like nice, pretty types, different types of these diagrams, but it's the same idea, just they could look differently. So for the essay, I just recommend you either do the monopoly diagram if it's a collusive oligopoly, or a Kinked-demand curve if it's a non-collusive diagram. And you could see what they look like over here. This is sort of the idea that we're going for. Obviously, in the exam, you would use blue and black colors. You wouldn't make it all nice and colorful, but this is just for visual sake. If you want to get these diagrams, if you want to get these notes, let me know and I will post them in the link in the description below. But for now, this has been everything for market structures. Oligopoly was the last market structure we looked at. If you want to look at other market structures, make sure to check videos in this playlist for that. And if you have any other videos you want to look at, let me know in the comments below and I will make a video for that topic.